Good evening, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World News Tonight, live from Warsaw. Russians and Americans sat down at the table in Saudi Arabia. What is the outcome of first negotiations in 3 years? And when will Donald Trump meet with Vladimir Putin? And how does Ukraine react to all this? More on that in a moment, but first, the latest headlines. Polish Prime Minister says no to sending Warsaw's peacekeepers to Ukraine. They survived hell in Russian captivity. Now members of the Azov Brigade share their stories. And Poland is facing the fiercest winter in nearly a century. Russia and the U.S. have taken the Ukraine peace talks to a next level, with both sides forming teams to work out peace solutions, meeting for the first time in the last 3 years. Already, the Russians have demanded that no NATO or European troops enter Ukraine as peacekeeping forces should a peace agreement be reached. Franciszek Pilis has more.
While described as still in its early stage, peace negotiations on the war in Ukraine are progressing between Russia and the U.S.
Today is the first step of a long and difficult journey, but an important one. And President Trump is committed to bringing an end to this conflict, and as he said when he campaigned for president. And he wants it to end in a way that's fair. He wants it to end in a way that's sustainable and enduring, not that leads to another conflict in 2 to 3 years.
Washington sent Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Middle East Envoy Steve Witkoff, and National Security Advisor Michael Waltz to represent the United States. While the Kremlin designated Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Kremlin Foreign Policy Advisor Yuri Ushakov, and Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, as their envoys. However, no Ukrainian or European officials were present at the talks.
Part of what we're probably seeing here is the Russians saying, look, for us to even get to the negotiating table, it's just got to be us in the U.S. because they're hoping to pull a fast one, basically create a trap. So I think that's initially why they're not there.
Following deliberations between European and UK leaders in Paris, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said he's, quote, prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground, alongside others, if there is a lasting peace agreement.
Keir Starmer will be setting out to Trump what he, and by extension some of the continental Europeans, believe are the minimum requirements for a sustainable peace, and to give him their view of President Trump, how he's likely to react, and why this outcome of the Ukraine conflict is just as important for America as it is for Europe.
However, Moscow has already canned the idea, saying the presence of NATO or EU troops in Ukraine is, quote, unacceptable.
Any kind of peacekeeping force, any kind of war-fighting machine comes down to logistics. And at this point, Europe is highly dependent on NATO logistics. And so that's going to be the tricky part. How do you get these troops in? How do you maintain them? How do you supply them with arms and munitions? How do you, rotate them in and out? And how do you keep them force protected if you need to? And right now, that's all NATO-centric.
Due to being denied entry to the negotiating room, the EU is determined to take the matter of the security of the European continent into its own hands.
It's like all of us, Ukraine and Europe, who have to help President Trump to win over his ambition and to bring sustainable peace to Ukraine, but also disable Russia from attacking again.
As a result of the talks in Paris, EU member states will now get to spend as much money as they wish on defense.
Defense spending will no longer be treated as excessive spending, so we will not be threatened by the procedure of an excessive deficit, which has its unpleasant consequences. So defense spending will not be treated as an excessive expenditure.
According to the Kremlin, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are unlikely to meet within the next week. With both Europe and Ukraine being sidelined in peace negotiations with Russia, President Zelensky called on Washington, saying the talks must not happen behind the backs of the EU and Kiev. For TVP World, Franciszek Pilis.
And we're going now straight to Kiev to our correspondent Oskar Teji, who has been listening to Ukrainian voices on peace negotiations without the country invited. Well, Ukrainian President Zelensky says he will never accept the outcome. So good evening, Oz. What are the Ukrainian reactions to the Riyadh meeting?
Well, I think it was very obvious from Zelensky's words what he thought. I mean, I will say that Zelensky cancelled or postponed, rather, his trip to Saudi Arabia. I'm pretty sure that definitely had something to do with the events that are unfolding. And his words today were pretty robust in his response to these events, certainly talking about not allowing Ukraine to be forced into ultimatums. It sounds very much like Zelensky is turning down the kinds of concessions that potentially Rubio is asking on behalf of Donald Trump. Let's take a listen to what Zelensky had to say in Ankara earlier on this afternoon.
Russia gave an ultimatum at the beginning of the full-scale invasion to reduce the number of armed forces of Ukraine and to recognize the occupied territories of Ukraine as Russian territories. They wanted to install a pro-Russian government, completely subordinate to Putin. And I have the impression that there are some negotiations going on now, and they are taking place with the same attitude. But they are taking place between representatives of Russia and representatives of the United States. About Ukraine, again about Ukraine, but without Ukraine. It's interesting because we didn't go for all these ultimatums at the most difficult moment. Why is there such a feeling that Ukraine will do this now?
It's quite interesting there that Zelensky compared the talks that Donald Trump's administration is having now with Russia with the talks that Biden and other world leaders attempted to have with Putin before the invasion in February 2022, almost saying that they're doomed to fail in the same way. Now, Ukrainians, on the other hand, they have their thoughts about this all too. Now, TVP World was out earlier on the streets speaking to Ukrainians about how they see these developments. Let's take a listen to what some of them had to say about it all.
I can't say that those things that we have, those positions in negotiations are good for us. But we don't have another choice, I think. I want that Donbass, Crimea was our territory. Putin will not stop, and we will have to fight further.
I hope that it will work, but I'm not sure about it. It's very difficult, but I hope that everything will be okay and it help to our country and we will live in peace.
So, mixed reactions there. I think there's a lot of nervousness and anticipation. They don't really have the details to dig into to find out what is being proposed. And the United States hasn't been really forthcoming with these ideas. Certainly the Russians are making their feelings clear, and that is obviously rankling some people here in Ukraine, particularly in the government, who are worried about the shape of things to come. Back to you in the studio.
So it is a time of great uncertainty in Kyiv. That was Oskar Terzi reporting from Ukraine's capital. Thank you very much. Early stages of peace talks between American and Russian representatives have already shown major differences and obstacles both sides will have to overcome to reach a lasting solution for Ukraine. In response to Donald Trump's idea of sending European troops as peacekeepers to Ukraine, Russia says it will not accept any such thing. Poland has so far ruled out the possibility of deploying its soldiers there. Kazimierz Łysiak has more.
Speaking ahead of the emergency European leaders summit in Paris, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk was hesitant to commit peacekeeping troops to Ukraine.
We're not planning to send Polish soldiers to Ukraine. However, we will offer logistical and political support to countries planning to offer such guarantees in the future.
U.S. President Donald Trump had earlier excluded the possibility of sending American troops to Ukraine as a security guarantee. This has left European nations to rise to the challenge. So far, only the United Kingdom has officially offered to send its soldiers.
Europe must play its role. And I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement.
According to one expert, Poland and other European countries not committing peacekeeping troops could be the case of political pragmatism.
Most of the countries are playing extremely safe because they are aware that one wrong step can push the dynamics in a very different direction.
With Russia now saying it wouldn't accept European forces in Ukraine as a peace guarantee, Poland seems to be waiting for the situation to become clearer. But experts also point to another context to this reluctance. Poland is preparing for a crucial presidential election in May.
The law and justice and the more right-wing political parties don't hesitate to use the Ukrainian narrative as they know that this is a very cheap source of political support.
Former Polish Prime Minister Leszek Miller believes Poland would be more eager to offer its peacekeeping troops if the United States hadn't backed down from that option.
If there are no Americans, we won't be there either. In the case of just the European contingent being there, if there was any clash with Russia, we wouldn't have our biggest protector to defend us.
With pieces on the chessboard still moving, the future of the peace in Ukraine remains uncertain. So does the possibility of European troops safeguarding a potential truce. Kazimierz Łysiak, TVP World.
The civilized world will never accept Ukraine-occupied territories as part of Russia, says the commander of Ukraine's Azov Brigade. As the outcome of peace negotiations remains unclear, it is likely that Ukraine will lose vast areas of its lands. For those who paid with their blood to defend them, this may prove to be a very bitter pill to swallow. Ovidiusz Nicieja reports.
Even though the details of a potential peace between Russia and Ukraine are still in the making, the Trump administration has suggested that Ukraine will have to make territorial concessions to Russia. Those who defended their homeland from the unlawful Russian aggression try to be diplomatic about it.
I fought for them, risked my life multiple times. I bled for those territories. We're a military unit, we're not politicians, okay? Our personal wants and wishes mean very little.
For a soldier, it's an order. When order will come, the war, we will stop fighting.
Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Chech and his wife Maria were both defending Mariupol and the last Ukrainian position there, the Azovstal steel plant.
That order was really difficult and we followed it. So that's what soldiers do.
They survived months of relentless bombing.
It was one of the good deep bunkers. The aviation bomb fell down, and two of my female friends, one of them, she was 23, young and beautiful, they died right on me. So when I lost also my conscience, when I opened my eyes, I could see nothing. I was under their bodies.
Later on, Mariupol surrendered, and its defenders were taken into Russian custody.
I don't recommend. I don't recommend that to anybody.
Right after he was released by the Russians, Yuri weighed 40 kilograms less than before the war. His wife, being married to a high-ranking Azov commander, also faced a nightmare during captivity.
As soon as I lost my conscience, they poured water again, and I was again I was back to reality, and then they continued torturing me. Sometimes it seemed to me they did it just for fun.
Mariupol is now under Russian occupation, just like some 1/5 of Ukraine's pre-war territory. Moscow regards 5 Ukrainian regions as parts of Russia, having appointed Kremlin-backed administrations there that are not internationally recognized.
The territory will be never be in Russia, and nobody will say that it's Russia.
For TVP World, Ovidiusz Nicieja.
The anti-government protests in Serbia continue. Despite the calls, protesters are determined to force through their proposal of forming an interim government with the ultimate goal of new elections. The idea is strongly opposed by President Alexander Vučić. Sonia Gatabiszczyn has the latest from Serbia.
Protests have been rocking Serbia since November.
I truly hope that one day this country of ours will become a normal country, that the institutions will start doing their job, and that I will not be forced to leave my country. It doesn't matter if the end is near or not. We are here until the end, and we will stand here every second. We are here to make this country a better place.
But the end might be near, as civil society is proposing a solution to the crisis.
The least painful way to overcome the current crisis in Serbia is to form an interim transitional government.
Although it is not a political party itself, Progress's proposal elicited support from opposition parties. In its view, a transitional government would meet two objectives.
First one is fulfillment of the conditions set out by the students. And the second would be organization of free and fair elections.
This is the first, I would say, most serious suggestion that is like somehow politically drafted.
Following a fatal railway station roof collapse in Novi Sad in November last year that killed 15 people, students initiated anti-government strikes, blaming the tragedy on corruption.
We put our personal ideologies aside because what we're doing here is bigger than all of that. We're trying to build a country.
One of the protesters' demands is the resignation of all those responsible for the tragedy, which led to Prime Minister Miloš Vučević's resignation and cabinet collapse. Elections or appointing a new prime minister to form a cabinet are the standard paths forward. Transitional government emerges as a third option, but is not the Serbian president's favorite.
There is no possibility of a transitional government.
Whether the transitional government will actually come to life remains to be seen, but continued protests could help.
Strong pressure from the inside, from the people, can basically make the ruling party accept a transitional government.
Stepping away from local pressure, Vučić was presented one of the highest Hungarian honors during a visit to Budapest. The country's Prime Minister Viktor Orban referred to Vučić as the champion of Balkan stability.
The government representatives and the president are actually asking their allies to back them up and to support them, and so they can, somehow establish this legitimacy that they lost at home.
Aside from the Prime Minister, the roof collapse and ongoing protests triggered the resignations of several other officials, including the mayor of Novi Sad, and spurred a crackdown on corruption, resulting in dozens of arrests. For TVP World, Sonja Gatabišćan.
Europe needs to spend more on defence and is eyeing the possibility of changing the bloc's fiscal rules to do so. Poland has so long advocated for exempting member states' defence spending from the EU's budgetary guardrails, and after much campaigning, change is finally afoot in the Belgian capital. EU correspondent Angela Skujins has more.
Poland's Finance Minister Andrzej Domański told reporters that after a lengthy financial and economics meeting in Brussels today, the EU was one step closer to allowing member states to spend more on defence. The official from Warsaw has long campaigned for countries such as Poland to spend more on their military portfolios without falling foul of the EU's strict finance rules. But good news came on Friday when European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced that to make room for increased defence spending, she would allow member states to activate the emergency fiscal clause. Here is what that Polish minister had to say about that announcement today.
I welcome the fact that the President of the Commission and many leaders agree with this approach that we need to increase the spending on defence. We may not have precisely the same view on how this should be achieved, which is why we start intense discussion at technical level already tomorrow.
The EU Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis was also present at those talks today, and he told reporters that a dial had been shifted in Brussels following the appointment of US President Donald Trump, who has signalled a more hawkish foreign affairs approach in terms of supporting Europe and its security needs. Here is what that commissioner had to say today.
Recent developments clearly show the urgency for the EU to act in responding to our security needs, because unfortunately the US commitment to European security is less certain now than probably it was under previous administration, and it's clear that EU needs to step up.
Now, the timeline for these fiscal rule revisions in terms of defence spending are pretty up in the air at the moment. A white paper on defence will be handed down in March. This should show member states what they should be spending their money on in terms of military, but the new rules will show them how they can spend that money in terms of what they can tap into. Angela Scugins from Brussels for TVP World.
Arctic weather has engulfed Poland with temperatures dropping below -41 degrees Celsius in the Tatra Mountains. Meanwhile, frozen lakes and rivers attract the risk-takers who frequently fall into the ice-cold water. Anastasia Yanchenko reports on one of the fiercest winters in the last 100 years.
This is what a true winter looks like in the Tatra Mountains. A fierce blizzard, strong winds, and temperatures plummeting to -41.1 degrees Celsius. Winter has shown its harshest side in the Tatras. The record-breaking cold was registered in Litworowy Kocioł, a place often referred to as Poland's cold pole. According to meteorologists, Poland hasn't experienced such extreme temperatures in nearly a century. The previous record was set on February 10, 1929, in the southern city of Żywiec, where thermometers showed -40.6 degrees Celsius.
Right now, a mass of Arctic air has pushed deep into Central Europe. Additionally, the Tatra valleys are known for trapping cold air, a phenomenon called cold air pooling. When there is little wind and clear skies, some temperature can drop dramatically overnight.
But it's not only the mountains that are feeling the impact of this Arctic freeze. Temperatures in central Poland have also dropped to dangerous levels. While winter lovers embrace the frosty weather, emergency services remain on high alert. Most rivers and lakes are now covered with ice, creating a false sense of security. However, rescue teams warn that entering onto the ice is extremely dangerous, as incidents of people falling through are becoming more frequent. These dramatic surveillance camera recordings, released by the Municipal Emergency Service, show 3 children walking on a frozen reservoir. Suddenly, the ice cracks, and one of the girls falls into the freezing water. She was submerged for 90 seconds before managing to pull herself out.
It's good that everything ended like this and the girl is alive, but I will say once again that going on the ice is simply a game with death. We as emergency services do everything we can to save others, but it doesn't always end well.
Not only people, but also animals are falling victim to the treacherous ice. In another dramatic video, released by the rescue service in the central Poland city of Zduńska Wola, a dog can be seen falling through the ice. The extreme cold will persist for a few more days, but according to meteorologists, temperatures will gradually rise by next week. But as long as the cold continues, it's essential to remember, winter is not only picturesque, but also dangerous. While appreciating its beauty, it is vital to follow safety precautions and stay careful.
The first stage of peace talks, the U.S. Russian meeting in Riyadh, has come to an end with no binding conclusions and with Russia rejecting the possibility of Western peacekeepers in Ukraine. What does Kyiv think about the negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine? To talk about it, we're joined by Dr. Timofey Milovanov, advisor to the President of Ukraine. Good evening.
Good evening.
So what do you make of the Riyadh meeting?
There's no real conclusions. The parties agreed to continue to agree. In fact, that's not very different from the reality. You look at the statement by the White House, by the State Department, you will see that there are 4 points there, and one of them is to establish a delegation, the other one is to establish a mechanism. So basically, it's preliminary talks about possible talks.
Is Ukraine being updated? But is Ukraine being updated on their progress?
Yeah, I do not know. I think there are conversations at the top leadership level, but Ukraine is really hurting. I think that it's, there are conversations about Ukraine without Ukraine.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that any deployment of NATO troops to Ukraine, even under a different flag, would be unacceptable to Moscow. Now, this is a very strong statement, sort of an ultimatum at the very beginning of peace negotiations. Now, if not by European NATO soldiers, do you think that Kyiv can accept any other way of providing it with security guarantees? Could Kyiv, for example, opt for a UN mission in Ukraine?
Well, so it depends on specifics of the mission. If the mission is going to be an observatory mission, we already have OBSC missions before. They didn't help to stop anything. We need security guarantees to make sure that Russia doesn't invade again. Or otherwise, let's just have a very frank conversation about this. This is not peace negotiations. This is a pause negotiation where Russia is able to restart the war at the time of its choosing. That's not what we want. That's not what's called peace.
So what should be the security guarantees, given the fact that Ukraine is very unlikely to join NATO anytime soon?
Troops, some variation of that, the weapons and financial support for defense industry.
I understand. President Zelensky says he will not accept any outcome of peace talks without Ukraine being involved. Now, do you know at what stage will Ukraine partake in them?
I have no idea, frankly. I don't think anyone knows when that might happen. But it must happen at some point because otherwise there is nothing to sign, right? Ukraine has to receive some documents, has to issue some proposals, has to ratify documents. In the end, we're a parliamentary republic. We have a parliament. It has to vote. It's not the 19th or 18th century where monarchs can decide how to corrupt Europe.
Some would say differently, especially now. What can Kyiv agree to? Now, I'm asking you about concessions because they will have to come at some point, definitely. President Zelensky says that Ukraine's territorial integrity is not negotiable. So what is there up to negotiations?
So Zelensky recently said that, of course, we cannot recognize formally the territories as Russians, and that is the case in many other conflicts. Look at Cyprus, for example. We realize the situation on the ground. There is de facto occupation, unless it is somehow agreed that which territories are exchanged or freed, then there's no, during the ceasefire or truce or peace, there's no fighting for those territories. So I think that is very understood very well by everyone. Similarly, that there's no appetite to admit Ukraine to NATO. It's basically Trump administration being honest and frank, unlike the Biden administration, and saying what the U.S. administrations have always meant since 2008, even before. No NATO except in Ukraine, until and a list of conditions and unclear when. So these two conditions that Russia imposing, they are in fact reality on the ground. Now Russia is asking for a couple of more conditions to disarm Ukraine and not to give security guarantees, but also to give up some of the unoccupied territories. All of these three conditions basically are impossible for Ukraine to meet, simply because there is no mechanism to do that, there is no political will, and it will be a political death sentence for any president, not just Zelensky in Ukraine.
Now, what do you make of the American proposal to stop attacking Ukrainian and Russian energy infrastructure?
Yeah, we are being attacked. Actually, you might hear a sound outside. This is an air alert. Yesterday there were attacks, there were blackouts, the infrastructure being damaged. It's really very cynical and hypocritical of Lavrov today to say that we rejected that proposal by the U.S. to stop attacking energy infrastructure. Why? Because we never attack, we never jeopardize the civilian infrastructure. I can tell you as a citizen, as a human, as human being, that I see blackouts. I live through blackouts. I see explosions. People die around me in Kyiv and elsewhere where I travel because Russians attack power plants, generating facility, transmission facility. That happens all the time.
Now, today, the U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, paid a visit to Warsaw and met with the Polish president ahead of his planned trip to Kiev, ahead of Kellogg's planned trip to Kiev. Now, what role do you see for Poland after some sort of peace is obtained? Well, Warsaw is, as we already know, reluctant to send its troops to Ukraine.
Yes, but at the same time, Poland has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine. We face a common enemy. We share the history of Russian attacks and threats coming from the Russian Empire. So we all get it. Yeah, we have our own frictions, but that's for politicians to work out. Between the people, I don't think there are frictions. We understand who the enemy is. And in the first years of the war, it's Poland who has given us most of the support, both humanitarian and military. And look at Poland taking very seriously the threat and improving its defense spending, improving its military, building up defense technology. So I think Poland gets it. There is evidence. Poland is leading the action in Europe, and I think it will continue to be an important leader in terms of the entire security infrastructure. Now, with specific details, I do hope that Poland will step in together with other governments and will provide troops or whatever will be the solution or decision. But if there is a country that I don't have any question about supporting Ukraine, notwithstanding all the issues between farmers and political history and things like that, but truly fundamentally with Ukraine, I think it's Poland.
Timothy Milovanov, advisor to the President of Ukraine, was our guest tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching, and stay with us for much more here on TVP World.